She walked into a maximum security prison with a leather medical bag and a small notebook. The warden looked at her silver hair and reading glasses and told her she didn't belong there. 12 days later, that notebook shut down his entire operation. Clara Vasquez was the last name on the county's list. Every other nurse refused the assignment. She took it without asking a single question. And from the moment she stepped through those gates, she started writing. Medication logs that didn't add up, treatments that only existed on paper, men dying from conditions any first-year nurse could have caught. But what nobody inside that prison knew, not the warden, not the doctor who signed the fake records, not a single guard at the gate, was that Clara had done this before, in places far worse, under fire, with lives on the line. And the one person who did know, a forgotten inmate serving 30 years, had been waiting 3 years for her to walk through that door. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Subscribe and hit that bell, because every single day on this channel, we tell stories about people the world counted out. And this one's just getting started. The call went out 4 times before it reached Clara Vasquez. The county nursing agency started at the top of their list that morning, calling the nurses they usually sent to the easy jobs, quiet clinics, rehab centers with nice gardens and working air conditioning. But one by one, every nurse heard the word Graystone and found a reason to say no. One had a schedule problem, another had a family thing. One woman just laughed and hung up the phone. By the time the person making calls scrolled down to Clara's name, it was almost noon. She picked up on the second ring, listened without cutting in, and said only, "What time do they need me?" The drive took just over 2 hours. The highway was flat and gray, under a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and rain. Clara kept both hands on the wheel of her old Camry. The radio was off. The windows were cracked just enough to let the air move through. Her medical bag sat upright on the passenger seat. Not the cheap nylon one the agency gave out, but a leather one she had owned for longer than most of her coworkers had been alive. It was packed the way it was always packed. Suture kit on top, trauma shears on the left side, pen light clipped to the inside pocket. That kind of order doesn't come from reading a list. It comes from years of reaching into a bag without looking and needing your hand to find the right thing every single time. She looked exactly like what the gate guard would later describe to his boss, a small woman with silver hair pinned flat, reading glasses hanging on a beaded cord around her neck, and the kind of face you'd expect behind the counter of a school library, not walking through the front gates of a maximum security prison. Graystone showed up slowly on the horizon, a low spread of concrete and razor wire sitting back from the road like something the land itself was trying to forget. Clara pulled into the visitor lot and parked between 2 empty spaces. She didn't get out right away. For a moment she just sat there, her eyes moving across the prison grounds, the fence line, the guard towers, the emergency exits, the distance between buildings. It was a quick, automatic look, the kind a person does without thinking when they've spent enough years walking into places where you needed to know how to get out fast. She caught herself doing it, looked down at the steering wheel, let out one slow breath through her nose. Then she grabbed her bag, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the gate. The intake process was slow and cold. Clara stood at the outer checkpoint while a guard looked over her ID badge, her agency paperwork, and her nursing credentials like he was reading a restaurant menu he didn't trust. He glanced up at her once, then back down at the photo on her badge, then back up again, as if he was trying to figure out how the woman standing in front of him matched the job she was claiming to do. He didn't say anything rude. He didn't have to. The look on his face said enough. After 10 minutes of waiting, a second guard led her through a metal detector and down a short hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and old paint. At the end of the hallway was another checkpoint, heavier doors, thicker glass, a camera mounted above the frame. And standing in front of it, with his hands clasped behind his back like a man who owned every square foot of the building behind him, was Warden Harlan Griggs. He was tall, clean uniform, pressed flat, mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been giving orders so long it had forgotten how to do anything else. He looked at Clara the way people look at a wrong delivery, not angry, just sure there had been a mistake. "You're the nurse the county sent?" he asked. His voice was calm, polite even, but there was nothing warm in it. Clara nodded. "Clara Vasquez, agency contract, general population health assessment." She held out her paperwork. Griggs didn't take it right away. He looked at her hands first, small, lined with age, then at the leather bag on her shoulder, then at her face. He took the papers slowly and flipped through them without reading closely. "Ma'am," he said, handing the papers back, "I requested medical personnel equipped for a high-security environment. I'm not sure the county understood what that means." Clara took the papers and put them back in her bag. She didn't respond. Griggs continued, his tone dropping slightly, the way someone talks when they want to sound helpful but really want you to leave. This facility handles violent offenders, long-term. The medical unit has its own rhythm, its own protocols. We've had outside staff before. Most of them last about half a day before they ask to be reassigned. He paused. You don't belong here, nurse. This place eats people like you alive. Clara looked at him, not with anger, not with a speech. She just stood still, the way a person stands when they've heard worse things from more dangerous people, and learned a long time ago that silence answers louder than words. My authorization is signed by the county, she said quietly. I'm here for a full shift assessment. If there's a legal reason I can't enter, I'll need it in writing. Griggs held her gaze for a long moment. Something behind his expression shifted. Not respect, not yet. More like the first flicker of awareness that this woman was not going to make it easy for him. He stepped aside. Not all the way, just enough. End of shift, he said. Then we reassess. Clara walked through. As she passed the glass partition that separated the checkpoint from the inmate intake corridor, she didn't notice the line of men being moved through processing on the other side. But one of them noticed her. An older inmate near the back of the line, thin, gray, with the slow shuffle of a man who had been inside for decades, stopped walking the moment he saw her face. A guard nudged his shoulder. Move. The inmate didn't move. He turned to the young corrections officer beside him and said something short and quiet. Just a few words. The CO frowned, not understanding, but he remembered them. The line moved on. Clara disappeared into the facility, and the words the old man whispered stayed with that young officer for the rest of the day. The medical wing at Graystone looked like it had been designed by someone who cared just enough to check a box. 2 small exam rooms with plastic chairs and paper-covered tables. A dispensary behind a locked steel door. A records office the size of a closet. Fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead like they were tired of being on. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment and took it all in without saying a word. A nurse learns a lot about a place just by standing still and looking. The only person inside was a man in his mid-30s sitting behind the main desk, rubbing his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. His name tag read Reeves, physician assistant. He looked up when Clara walked in and gave her the kind of nod that said he was too tired to pretend he was glad to see her, but too polite to ignore her completely. You're the agency nurse? He asked. Clara Vasquez. Reeves pointed loosely at the room around him. Well, welcome to it. Before Clara could ask a question, a second voice came from the hallway behind her. I heard the county finally sent someone. She turned. The man walking toward her was mid-40s, neat hair, clean white coat over a collared shirt. The kind of appearance that suggested he spent more time looking like a doctor than being one. His name was Dr. Nolan, state-contracted physician. He visited Graystone 2 days a week, signed what needed signing, and left before lunch. He shook Clara's hand the way people shake hands when they want to set a boundary without saying it out loud. Firm, brief, one pump. I oversee all medical operations here, Nolan said. Your role is intake physicals and routine immunizations. Anything outside that scope, you check with me first. We run a tight operation. He said it like he believed it. Maybe he once did. Clara nodded. Understood. Nolan left within minutes. Clara watched him go, then turned back to the room and started working. She began with the supply cabinets, opened them one by one, counting what was inside and comparing it to the inventory sheet taped to the door. The numbers didn't match. The sheet said 40 units of insulin in stock. Clara counted 19. The sheet said 12 boxes of wound care supplies. She found 5, and 2 of those were half empty. She moved to the crash cart next, the emergency kit that's supposed to be ready at all times in any medical setting. She unlatched it and looked inside. The epinephrine had expired 2 months ago. The airway kit was missing a seal. The defibrillator pads were still in their packaging, but the battery indicator showed red. Clara didn't say anything. She just pulled everything out, checked each piece, and started putting the cart back together in a different order. Airway tools on top, circulation supplies next, hemorrhage control on the side. Fast access staging. The kind of setup where every second matters and your hands need to know where to go before your brain catches up. Across the room, Reeves watched her do it. He didn't say a word, but his eyes stayed on her hands the whole time, and something small shifted in his expression, like he was watching someone speak a language he half remembered from a long time ago. Clara finished restaging the cart, closed it, and pulled a small notebook from her bag. She flipped it open and began writing. Supply counts, expiration dates, discrepancies. Line after line in tight, careful handwriting. Then she looked up at Reeves. I'd like to start seeing patients. Reeves nodded slowly. I'll pull the intake list. The first patients came in one at a time. Standard stuff at first. Blood pressure checks, medication reviews, the kind of routine visits that fill a shift without making noise. But Clara was paying attention to more than what was on the charts. She was paying attention to what wasn't. A man in his 50s came in for a diabetes follow-up. His chart said he'd been receiving insulin 3 times a week for the past 6 months. Clara checked his fingertips. The skin was dark and thickened in the places where blood sugar testing should have been happening regularly. But the pattern was wrong. The damage was too advanced for someone supposedly on a steady medication schedule. She looked at his chart again, then at his hands, then back at the chart. She wrote something in her notebook and said nothing. The next patient had a wound on his lower leg. The chart said the dressing had been changed that morning, but when Clara unwrapped it, the gauze underneath was stiff and yellow, days old at least. The skin around the wound was red and hot to the touch, early infection. Left alone much longer, it would spread. She cleaned and redressed the wound herself, carefully, without rushing. The inmate sat still and watched her work like he wasn't sure what to do with someone who actually touched the injury instead of just writing about it. Clara made another note, then another. By the time she had seen her 5th patient, the notebook had a full page of entries. None of them matched what the official records said. Clara didn't mention what she had found to anyone. She didn't need to. The notebook in her bag was filling itself one patient at a time, and the story it was telling was getting harder to explain away as sloppy record-keeping. This was a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. She kept working through the afternoon, moving from one exam to the next with the same quiet focus. But something around her had started to change, something she didn't cause and didn't control. It started with the young corrections officer from the intake corridor, the one who had heard the old inmate whisper those strange words that morning. His name was Dawson, and he had been thinking about what he heard all day. He didn't understand the words exactly. They sounded military, some kind of coded call sign. But the way the old man had said them, like they were sacred, like they mattered more than anything he'd said in years, stuck with him. Dawson didn't tell Griggs. He didn't file a report. But he started doing something small. He began positioning himself near the medical wing during Clara's rounds. Not guarding her exactly, just being close. When she needed a patient brought in from B block, Dawson made sure the escort happened without the usual 30-minute delay. When she asked Reeves for a file that Reeves seemed nervous to pull, Dawson gave a quiet nod from the doorway and the file appeared. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She just kept working. Other small things shifted too. A supply closet that had been locked all morning was left open when she came back from a break. A guard she hadn't spoken to held a door for her without being asked. Not a big gesture, just a half-second pause that hadn't been there before. These were tiny cracks in the system, barely visible. But Clara had spent enough years in hard places to know what it looked like when people started quietly choosing a side. Late in the afternoon, she saw a name on the chronic care roster that made her stop. Joseph Delacroix, age 61, serving 30 years, high blood pressure, joint deterioration, chronic respiratory issues. All treatable, all poorly managed. Clara read his intake file slowly. Birthplace, a coastal province in West Africa. Date of entry into the United States, 1989, through a refugee resettlement program. The timeline fit something she hadn't thought about in a very long time. She closed the file and sat still for a moment. Then she opened it again, picked up her pen, and added his name to the afternoon's patient list like he was anyone else. When Joseph was brought in for his checkup, he sat down across from her and said nothing. Clara checked his blood pressure, listened to his breathing, examined his swollen joints. She worked with the same steady, careful hands she used on every other patient. Joseph watched her the whole time. His eyes never left her face. But he didn't speak, and neither did she. When she finished, she asked the same question she asked everyone. "Anything else bothering you?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You should look at Block C. There are men in there who haven't seen a nurse in 4 months." Clara wrote it down. She closed his file, nodded once, and called for the next patient. But after Joseph left the room, her hand stayed on the notebook for a few seconds longer than usual. And for just a moment, her steady expression carried something she hadn't let anyone in that building see. The faintest trace of recognition, pushed down deep, held tight behind a face that had learned a long time ago how to keep its secrets. Clara asked for access to Block C the next morning. She submitted the request through proper channels. A written form to the warden's office citing her county authorization, which included general population health assessments across all housing units. The request was denied within the hour. Security concern. Outside her assignment scope. The language was polite and official, the kind of rejection designed to look reasonable on paper while keeping the door shut in practice. Clara read the denial, folded it neatly, and put it in her bag next to the notebook. She didn't argue. She didn't go to Griggs. Instead, she went back to work and waited. The opening came that afternoon, and it came from Dawson. The young CO stopped by the medical wing near the end of his shift and mentioned, almost casually, that a routine medical check round was scheduled for Block C the following morning. Standard procedure. A quick walkthrough to confirm inmate wellness before weekly counts. Any medical staff on duty were permitted to accompany the escort team. He said it like he was making conversation, but the way he held Clara's gaze for an extra second told her everything she needed to know. The next morning, Clara was waiting at the Block C security door when Dawson arrived with his escort team. He didn't say a word, just nodded and held the door open. What she found inside was worse than the chart suggested. Block C held long-term inmates, men who had been inside for 15, 20, 30 years. Most of them had chronic conditions that needed regular monitoring. On paper, they were receiving it. In reality, some of them hadn't been seen by a medical professional in months. The first man Clara examined had an abscess on his lower back the size of a fist. The skin around it was swollen, hot, and streaked with red lines running outward, early signs of sepsis. His chart said the wound had been evaluated 2 weeks ago and was healing normally. Clara looked at the wound and then looked at the chart and set the chart down without a word. She cleaned and drained the abscess right there in the man's cell, using supplies from her own bag. The inmate sat perfectly still the entire time, gripping the edge of his bunk, not because of the pain, but because he couldn't believe someone was actually treating it. The next cell held a man in his 60s with chest pain that had been going on for days. His chart listed it as anxiety. Clara checked his pulse, listened to his chest, and found an irregular heartbeat that had nothing to do with nerves. She flagged him for immediate transfer to the facility's medical unit and made a note so detailed that ignoring it would take more effort than acting on it. A third man was shaking. Not from cold, from withdrawal. His psychiatric medication had been listed as discontinued by physician recommendation 3 months earlier. But there was no taper schedule in his file, no follow-up, no transition plan. He had simply been cut off, and his body had been paying the price ever since. Clara treated what she could. She documented what she couldn't. Every entry in her notebook was specific. Dates, medication names, chart discrepancies, physical findings that directly contradicted the official records. She wasn't building a complaint, she was building a case. By the time she finished her round in Block C, she had seen 11 inmates. 9 of them had conditions that were either untreated or treated only on paper. The pattern she had noticed on her first day wasn't a pattern anymore. It was a system. She was walking back through the corridor toward the medical wing when a voice stopped her. "Nurse Vasquez?" She turned. Dr. Nolan was standing near the security door, his white coat buttoned, his expression flat and controlled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You were not authorized to conduct examinations in Block C," he said. "I am the physician of record for this facility. If you have clinical concerns, you bring them to me. You do not go around me." Clara looked at him calmly. "I accompanied a routine wellness check. Any medical staff on duty are permitted to join escort rounds. I treated what I found." "What you found," Nolan repeated, his jaw tightening just slightly, "is within the scope of ongoing care plans that I have approved." Clara didn't blink. "I'll include my observations in my agency report. Standard procedure." It wasn't a threat. She said it the same way she might have said the weather was going to change, a simple fact that didn't need permission to be true. Nolan stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Clara watched him go. Then she opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote down the time and exactly what he had said. The thing about a place like Graystone is that it doesn't warn you before it breaks open. 1 minute the hallways are quiet, the next minute everything changes. And the people who survive those moments aren't the ones who panic the least. They're the ones who've been preparing for them their whole lives without knowing it. Clara was in the medical wing updating her notes when the radio on Dawson's belt crackled so loud it made Reeves flinch behind his desk. "Code Blue, exercise yard, multiple casualties, medical to yard entrance immediately." Reeves stood up fast, knocking his chair backward. His face went white. Clara was already moving. By the time they reached the yard entrance, two guards were carrying a man between them, his face covered in blood from a gash above his eyebrow. Behind them came another inmate limping badly, his arm bent at an angle that arms aren't supposed to bend. A third man was being dragged on a stretcher by two COs who looked like they were barely holding it together. And behind all of them, the one nobody was paying enough attention to, a fourth man sat slumped against the fence, hand pressed against his chest, breathing in short, shallow gasps that were getting slower. A fight in the yard. Two inmates. But the damage had spread fast and wide. The medical wing wasn't built for this. Two exam rooms, one crash cart that Clara had restaged 2 days ago. Supplies she already knew were short. And the only doctor on contract was Dr. Nolan, who was somewhere in the building but hadn't appeared yet. Reeves froze in the doorway. Not completely. His body was moving, his hands reaching for gloves, but his eyes had that look. The look of someone whose mind was running through everything that needed to happen and realizing there wasn't enough of him to make it all work. Clara didn't freeze. She didn't shout. She just started. Bring the chest pain to exam 1. Fracture goes to exam 2. Lacerations wait in the hall. Reeves, you take the head wound. Pressure first, then check his pupils. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made people listen. Not because she was yelling orders, because she sounded like someone who had done this before. Not in a place like this, but in places far worse. The guards moved. Reeves moved. Nobody questioned it. Clara went straight to the man against the fence, the one everyone had walked past. She knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was there, but it was weak and uneven, skipping beats like a clock running out of power. His skin was gray. His breathing was getting worse. This wasn't from the fight. This had been building for days, maybe weeks. A heart that had been calling for help inside a body that nobody had listened to. Clara opened the crash cart she had restaged herself and pulled exactly what she needed without looking. Airway first, oxygen, cardiac monitoring leads pressed to his chest. Her hands moved in a sequence that was fast but never rushed, each step flowing into the next like she had done it 1,000 times in 1,000 worse places. Reeves glanced over from exam 1 and watched her work for just a few seconds. The sequence she was using, airway, circulation, hemorrhage control, it was the same order she had arranged the crash cart in on her first day. Not hospital protocol. Something older. Something trained into the hands through repetition in places where you didn't get second chances. He turned back to his patient, but something in his face had changed. The door opened behind Clara. Nolan walked in, white coat on, reading the scene like a man arriving late to a meeting he hadn't prepared for. "What happened?" he asked. "Yard fight," a guard said. 4 injured. Nolan looked at the room, at Reeves stitching the head wound, at the inmate with the broken arm waiting in the hall, and at Clara on the floor next to the man whose heart was failing. He moved toward her. "I'll take over here," he said. Clara didn't look up. "He's in acute cardiac distress. I've started stabilization. I'm the physician on record, nurse. Step aside." Now here's the thing the audience needs to understand. There's a moment in every emergency when the room decides who it trusts. It doesn't happen with words. It doesn't happen with titles. It happens when people look around and their bodies, not their brains, tell them who to follow. Clara looked up at Nolan. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "His rhythm is irregular and his oxygen is dropping. I need 3 more minutes." And then she turned back to the patient and kept working. Nolan stood there. The room was silent except for the monitors. Every guard, every officer, every set of eyes in that hallway was watching. And not one of them moved to help Nolan take over. Because the room had already decided. 3 minutes later, the man's breathing steadied. His pulse found its rhythm. The gray in his skin started to pull back. He wasn't out of danger, but he was alive. And everyone in that room knew he wouldn't have been if Clara hadn't gone to him first while everyone else walked past. Clara pulled off her gloves, dropped them into the bin, and picked up her notebook. She didn't look at Nolan. She didn't need to. But somewhere across the room, sitting on the edge of a bench with a bandage being wrapped around his forearm, a quiet inmate, a man who had served 2 tours in Fallujah before the world threw him away, stared at Clara's hands. He had seen that sequence before. He had seen those hands before. Not her hands specifically, but hands that moved like that. In places where the sand was red and the helicopters were always late. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But his eyes followed her for the rest of the afternoon. And what he eventually told the man in the cell next to his would be the first thread that unraveled everything. Inside a place like Graystone, information doesn't move through emails or announcements. It moves the way water moves through cracks, quietly, steadily, and into every corner whether you want it to or not. The inmate from Fallujah didn't make a scene. He didn't stand up in the yard and tell a story. He just leaned against the wall of his cell that evening and said a few words to the man next door through the gap near the floor. That nurse, the older woman, she runs combat medicine. I watched her triage 4 men today. That's not something you learn in nursing school, the man next door told someone at breakfast. That person told someone during work detail. By the next afternoon, the quiet conversation had reached every block in the facility. Not as gossip, but as something closer to fact. The kind of fact that men in prison pay attention to, because their survival sometimes depends on knowing who in the building can actually help them. At the same time, a different thread was moving through the guards. Dawson had been carrying the old inmate's whisper in his head for 2 days now. The call sign, short, phonetic, military-structured, didn't mean anything to him, but it meant something to someone. So during a shift change, he repeated it to Officer Mendez, a corrections officer in his late 40s, who had served in Afghanistan before joining the prison system. Mendez heard the words and stopped chewing his sandwich. "Say that again," he said. Dawson repeated it. Mendez set the sandwich down slowly. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "That's an Army Nurse Corps call sign, old format. They stopped using that structure after the early operations overseas." He paused. "Where did you hear it?" "An inmate, old guy in processing. He said it the moment he saw the new nurse walk in." Mendez looked through the window toward the medical wing. Clara was inside, writing in her notebook, her back to the glass. Small, silver-haired, reading glasses hanging around her neck. Mendez had never met her before, but he had heard a story, years ago, passed between soldiers the way soldiers pass stories they don't want to forget. A young field nurse during a refugee camp collapse overseas. A woman who refused to leave until every person was carried out. A name the military buried in paperwork, but never managed to bury in the memories of the people who were there. He couldn't say for certain that the woman sitting in that medical wing was the same person from the story. But the call sign matched. The way she moved matched. And the way Dawson described what happened in the yard, the triage sequence, the calm, the way the room followed her without being told, that matched too. Mendez didn't go talk to Clara. He didn't file a report. He just nodded slowly at Dawson and said, "Keep doing what you're doing." And from that moment on, there wasn't a guard in Graystone who didn't know that the quiet old nurse in the medical wing was something more than what her agency badge said. Clara went back to see Joseph the next morning. Not because anyone asked her to. Because his blood pressure reading from 2 days ago needed a follow-up, and Clara followed up on everything. The guard brought Joseph into the exam room and closed the door. Joseph sat down slowly, the way men do when their joints have been ignored for too long. Clara wrapped the cuff around his arm and pumped it in silence. The room was quiet except for the soft hiss of air releasing from the valve. His pressure was better. Not good, but better. She made a note and reached for his chart. "You didn't come here because of the county." Clara's pen stopped moving. She didn't look up. Joseph's voice was low and steady, not accusing, not emotional, just honest the way a man gets when he's been holding something for a very long time and is finally sitting across from the only person who would understand. "I wrote letters," he said. 3 years of letters. To the state health office, to the nursing board, to county oversight. I told them what was happening in here. Men going blind from diabetes nobody treated. Infections that turned into amputations. A man on my block who died from a blood clot that anyone with basic training could have caught. Clara listened. Her hand rested flat on the notebook. "Most of the letters never made it out," Joseph continued. "Guards threw them away. Some got through. Nobody responded. Then one day the county finally called Graystone and said they were sending a nurse." He paused. "They didn't send you because of me. I know that. But you're here because I wouldn't stop writing." Clara said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "Your blood pressure medication needs adjusting. I'm changing the dosage today." Joseph almost smiled. Almost. But he wasn't finished. "I knew who you were the second I saw your face at that checkpoint," he said. "I was 7 years old in that camp. I don't remember much. I remember the heat. I remember people screaming. And I remember a young woman in a uniform who picked me up off the ground when the roof came down and carried me out through the smoke while everyone else was running the other direction." The room was very still. "I'm not asking you to remember me," Joseph said. "I'm asking you to do what you did then. Don't leave until it's done." Clara looked at him for the first time since he started talking. Not with surprise, not with tears, with something quieter than both. the expression of a woman who had carried that same memory for 40 years and never expected to meet it again, sitting across from her in a prison exam room. She closed his file. "Take your medication on time," she said. "I'll check you again Thursday." Joseph nodded once and stood up slowly. The guard opened the door. He shuffled out without looking back. Clara sat alone in the room for exactly 4 seconds longer than she needed to. Then she opened her notebook, turned to a new page, and went back to work. Clara's agency report was 12 pages long. Every page was specific. Patient names matched to chart entries that didn't add up. Medication logs that showed treatments never given. Supply inventories inflated to justify funding that wasn't being spent on care. 2 inmate deaths in the past 18 months from conditions that should never have been fatal. Deaths that were documented as unavoidable, but were anything but. She submitted the report at the end of her shift through the county's secure filing system. No phone calls, no dramatic confrontations, just a document uploaded to the people whose job it was to act on it. They acted faster than anyone at Graystone expected. Within 48 hours, the state health department sent an unannounced inspection team. 3 officials walked through the front gate with credentials and clipboards and the kind of authority that doesn't ask permission. They pulled medical records. They opened supply cabinets. They interviewed inmates in Block C with a court-appointed patient advocate present. The numbers didn't match. The records didn't hold. And the explanations that had kept the system running for years fell apart under the weight of 12 pages written in tight, careful handwriting by a woman most people in that building had looked right past. Dr. Nolan's contract was terminated before the end of the week. No press conference, no arrest, just a phone call from the state medical board informing him that his credentials were under review and his access to Graystone was revoked, effective immediately. He cleaned out his office in 15 minutes and left through the side entrance. Nobody walked him out. Warden Griggs was placed on administrative leave the same day. 2 state officials sat across from him in his own office and explained that the facility would be placed under independent oversight, pending a full investigation. Griggs listened without speaking. When they finished, he stood up, removed his badge, and set it on the desk. The door closed behind him, and the building didn't feel any different, except that it did. Reeves cooperated fully. With the threat of retaliation gone, he provided everything. Every shortcut he had witnessed, every record he knew was wrong, every time he had wanted to speak up but didn't because the system above him made silence easier than truth. It didn't erase the years he stayed quiet, but it was a start. The inmates in Block C were assessed by an outside medical team the following week. Real assessments, real treatment plans, medications that actually reached the people whose names were on the bottles. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was happening. And it was happening because one woman sat down with a notebook and wrote the truth in a place that had been surviving on lies. Clara packed her bag the same way she had unpacked it. Suture kit on top, trauma shears on the left, pen light clipped to the inside pocket. She zipped it closed and set it on the desk for a moment, looking around the medical wing one last time. Reeves was sitting at his desk, writing something. He looked up when she reached the door. "Clara." She turned. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something big, something about what she had done, what she had changed, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just said, "Thank you." Clara nodded once. "Keep the crash cart stocked. Check it every Monday." Reeves almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She walked down the corridor toward the front gate. Her footsteps were the only sound in the hallway. At the final checkpoint, Dawson was standing by the door. He wasn't assigned to gate duty that day. He had no official reason to be there. He held the door open without a word. Clara walked through and gave him a small nod, the kind that carries more weight than a handshake when both people understand what it means. The sun hit her face as she stepped outside. Graystone sat behind her, low and gray and unchanged on the surface. But something underneath it had shifted, and everyone inside those walls knew it. Clara put her bag on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the visitor lot. At the first stoplight past the prison road, her phone buzzed. A message from the county agency. Another facility. Another place no one else wanted to go. She read it once, set the phone down, and kept driving. So let me ask you this. If you were Reeves, if you saw everything that was happening and stayed quiet for years, could you forgive yourself for that? And what do you think hit harder? The moment the guards stepped aside without Griggs knowing why, or the moment Joseph told Clara who he really was? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, Hit that like button so it can reach someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And share this with someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated. 2 more stories are on screen right now. Watch those next. See you tomorrow, same time, brand new video.